everyone. Welcome to this discussion in the Downtown End, which is a little unusual, a bit different, because we're reviewing the election results from last week. We're going to get the thoughts of Downtown's political editor, Jim Hancock, and Adam McNicholas, Adam, former Labour advisor. And we were hoping to be joined by somebody from the Conservative Party today. Unfortunately, she's been unable to make it, but we are going to post an interview with her on another occasion so that we've got some balance. But for today's proceedings, I'm going to be the Conservative drum banger, if you like. And I will start by coming to you, Jim, and saying, what a fantastic night, certainly on the face of it, for Boris Johnson and the government.
Absolutely incredible. After 11 years in government, either in coalition or by themselves, it defied all the sort of normal rules of elections. Normally elections in midterm are an occasion for the government to be given a punishment by the voters, but this clearly hasn't happened. I think, the enormous factors in this, which we can talk perhaps a bit later on about what sort of trends are going on in terms of the political parties and how they're positioning themselves. But, it is the case that these elections were held against two enormous factors, one which was perfectly obvious, which was the pandemic and the gratitude that an awful lot of people felt for the way in which the government had handled it. It would take a great deal of incompetence for politicians not to take advantage of what has been a masterly exercise in vaccinating the population, or most of the population. But of course, the other factor, which we thought had begun to fade into the distance, is Brexit, and particularly in the northeast of England, those two very big factors were playing into the hands of the Conservative Party. And that, I think, is part of the explanation of this extraordinary performance in England. We have to sort of qualify almost everything we say today, haven't we? Because, of course, in Wales, everyone thinks now it's the television age where you have to have charismatic leaders like Boris Johnson, and that's an explanation for political success. Well, with great respect to the leader of the Welsh Senate, he is not a charismatic figure. He's more like a university professor. But in Wales, doggedly carrying on, delivering the pandemic and delivering the restrictions in a way that I think the Welsh people broadly sympathise with, he had a success. And then Scotland, everybody knows what the issues are there, and Boris Johnson's faced with a huge challenge that the new Conservative leader didn't do very well, and a big constitutional issue is looming up. So it's a nuanced picture. That's my national take on things. Perhaps we'll come on to the northwest and the north of England in particular later on.
Yeah, we'll do a bit more specifics in terms of drilling into some of the results. But I just wanted to ask your view of Boris, because, he's Marmite to an extent. There's lots of people who don't like him, even within his own party. But if I can use a football analogy, he seems to be a big game player. So, we all know footballers who will turn up for the big matches. The big favourite of mine, for example, Duncan Ferguson, but he only used to play against Liverpool, Manchester United, Arsenal and Tottenham. A wet and windy night, Wednesday night at Wimbledon, he wasn't really at his best. And it seems to me that Johnson just has this way of, when you're facing elections, of being able to somehow connect with the British public. And the reason the Conservative Party elected him, let's face it, is because he is perceived as a winner. Jim, do you know what Johnson has got that other leaders don't appear to have?
Well, you're absolutely right, because throughout his political career, he's defied know-it-all political pundits like myself. 2 terms as the mayor of London in a capital city that was increasingly going Labour at that time. Ken Livingstone, a great giant of the Labour movement, underestimated him, and he had 2 terms there. I didn't think he'd become leader of the Conservative Party. I didn't think he was the right fit for it. But I think he's got a couple of things going for him. I do think his personality, his identifiability, is quite a factor. Although I've already nuanced that by what's happened in Wales, because there are other things can compensate for that. But his recognisability. But I think the main thing I'd say about him is his unbridled optimism. I mean, he generally tries to keep upbeat. And I really think this is relevant because I do think there's a danger that it's very difficult for the Labour Party in many ways, but, you know, Keir Starmer's generally a very downbeat, but it's a rather depressing message and all this sort of thing. Things aren't going well when people feel they are going well. So wherever Boris goes, and sometimes he's brazen about it, but he exudes optimism. And I think particularly recently, people have needed a bit of that. So that would be my explanation for his incredible election success. Plus, you know, as Napoleon said, I want lucky generals. And he has been lucky. He caught the mood of the nation with Brexit. And, it wasn't luck. But I mean, I suppose the development of the jab, I mean, it could have gone wrong scientifically. We might not have invented it. But the government, you know, the scientists, the government gave the initiative and the scientists delivered, and he's been lucky as well as charismatic and optimistic. That would be my thoughts about that.
Thanks, Jim. And Adam, welcome to the Den. And listen, you're sat in the West Midlands, where, of course, there was a key seat, the mayoralty, the West Midlands, where the incumbent Andy Street was successful again, Conservative, former Chief Executive of John Lewis. I think it's fair to say sells himself very much as a Conservative with a small c, you know, very much sees himself as being almost above the party political fray. But it was a target for Labour. Certainly they'd been disappointed in Liam Byrne not being returned to office there. So two things really, Adam, to start the conversation with you. You know, the West Midlands mayoralty in that contest, and where you think Andy got it right, perhaps. And then broader, you know, again, West Midlands, like the North, lots of red wall seats have been demolished by the Conservatives. And what is the reason for that? What do you think the Labour Party can do about it?
So the West Midlands, yeah. I'll declare. I was the campaign director for the campaign in 2017, which was a very, very different contest back then. But the Tories, I should say, Andy Street won the seat by 1%. He won it again this time, I think, against a very strong candidate in Liam Byrne. I think I want to sort of zoom out and then zoom back in, because I think that this wasn't this wasn't kind of elections happening uniformly everywhere. These were totally different kinds of elections in different parts of the country. And that's not to try and paint a more rosy picture than I think is due. But if we start with the elections and the results coming in on Thursday morning, one of the things that really shaped the whole narrative about these sets of elections was, of course, Hartlepool. Now, the Hartlepool by-election was a fascinating race in many respects, but the seat was Labour in name only. The seat was not a Labour seat. The Brexit Party won with the Brexit Party obviously stood in 2019 and they got 10,000 votes. This was really a Conservative seat that Labour hung on to only because Richard Tice stood as a prominent Brexit Party candidate in the 2019 election. So what then happened was the whole narrative about these elections was sort of distorted by a single parliamentary seat. That's not to say in any way that Labour should not be alarmed, and very alarmed by what happened in Hartlepool. But I think as we've got through the weekend, we've seen other results elsewhere that have been slightly more encouraging. And for people who follow politics closely, they'll be familiar with the national projected share of the vote that the BBC puts together. So it's the aggregate analysed
And Jim, in terms of the Labour Party challenges, and Adam's touched upon it there, hasn't he? In terms of the realignment, if you like, of politics and what people are voting for these days, because I think. The notion that it's sort of working class, middle class, or it's the economy stupid, it seems to me that culture wars are actually becoming central to the political debate and political narrative these days. And people are very much instinctively deciding which party they support, not necessarily because of the economics anymore, but because they see a more traditional approach, if I can put it that way, from the Conservative Party. And a phrase I hate, but it's out there, the Labour Party and others in opposition being described as woke. And as Adam said there, you do have an older population who are concerned about immigration, who are proud of British history, who aren't ashamed of the Union Jack, and who actually see this country as a great place to be. And the view that you took earlier, an optimistic view of the country and its past and its future. So do Labour really need to start to rethink the way it's approaching politics now, because, you know, I've never seen a political leader in the past be slaughtered by his own party for putting a Union Jack in the background of a political broadcast. You know, it does seem to me that there's a real disconnect now, and a dangerous disconnect emerging between the Labour Party, its membership, and indeed some of its MPs, and those who we'd have described in the past as being its natural supporters.
Yeah, it is very, very difficult for Labour. I mean, we have to bear in mind that a quarter of Labour MPs now come from the London area. And I'm not anti-London at all, but you do sometimes think there's a sort of a different prioritisation of issues in the London area. No one wants, Labour above all, wants racism or anything like that, but gender equality and things like that, those issues do not resonate in the same way. And the huge challenge for Labour, and I'm not convinced that most of the Labour Party yet wants to embrace this, it needs to be a party that embraces all those things that you've outlined, the love of country, patriotism. And then we get into the difficult ones like immigration and things like that, taking account of people's anxieties on that front. But it is extremely difficult, because one other thing I've thought of about Boris Johnson is he's pretty loose with the traditions of the Conservative Party. I mean, I know it's been enhanced by the pandemic, but Labour's up against the Conservative Party that's spending vast amounts of money, that is employing the big state to achieve things at the moment. I mean, those things were central, a belief in the ability of the state to deliver things and to spend money on projects were central things to the Labour Party, and it's at the moment been inversed. And there are indications that even when the pandemic's over, I mean, if this levelling up really gets going, and you can see with Ben Houchin in Tees Valley, everyone was saying, he's delivered. So what does the Labour Party do? You know, being absolutely pragmatic, and I'm very interested in what Adam thinks about this, is easing back a bit on some of those social issues and really identifying with the priorities of people who are not racist, but they are concerned about immigration. They're not selfish, but they, you know, are proud of the money that they've got and things like that. And trying to appeal to that, because at the moment it's gone. I mean, in Hartlepool, it was very striking. People were saying all these references to the old industries and Keir Starmer even going in a fish and chip shop. Some people regarded that as patronising, because Hartlepool's moved on from that. And it's still got a huge deprivation and so on, but they don't relate to shipbuilding and mining and things like that. They've moved on. And it's identifying that and being a party that's prepared to embrace some of those things that London wokers, if I can put it like that, aren't necessarily comfortable with. But, you know, Keir Starmer's from North London, and this, we may come on to discuss the suitability of North London, or perhaps somebody from Greater Manchester to lead the Labour Party in due course. But that it's very, very difficult. It's extremely difficult for Labour at the moment. But you know, really, it's a question for Adam. You know.
Yeah. Jim, I think it's a really interesting point, and let us not forget the Prime Minister went to Eton. So this idea that that background it matters as the fundamental. The fundamental problem with the Labour Party that it's had for some time across different leaders of the party has been that the party projects a series of priorities, vast quantity of priorities. So they're not priorities, because in politics is all about priorities. A vast body of priorities that are totally different to the voters' priorities in huge swathes of Middle England. Now, I know we've been focusing quite a lot on England, and we should come on and talk about what's going on with Scotland. But until the Labour Party gets to a place, because it gets to a mindset that means we can focus on three things that are the most important things to the country, and we can build a credible offer on those three things in a way that is relatable. Until we can do that, we just look like we just look like we're not serious, because you can't be taken seriously until it looks like you're credible on something. And so, you know, I think Keir has has done a good job in phase one, which has been the sort of, for want of a better characterization, has been the competence phase, and now he's certainly moving into the next phase, which has got to be about vision and but also sort of ruthless prioritisation of what a future Labour government would offer, because there are holes in the Conservatives' agenda. Let's see what happens when when the furlough ends. Let's see what happens with a whole bunch of stuff on the economy. But if we could prioritise, we could really damage the Conservatives on crime and law and order, because their record on law and order has been to massively reduce police numbers, has been a huge increase in all kinds of crime. I mean, I was up in Hartlepool doing some research, and it was a sort of clipboard outside the Asda talking to people, and what was absolutely clear is that crime was a big issue there, and I think Labour was focused on that, but there is a deeper credibility issue that the Labour Party faces, and I think that has to be addressed by addressing the fundamentals of the party and some of the problems that the public associates with us, before you can really get on to landing blows on the Prime Minister's credibility. I mean, people were getting.
You see, sorry to interrupt, but just to sort of say, I absolutely realise that I was a bit surprised to hear Stephen Bush say that Labour's got masses of policies and can't decide between them. I'm not aware of that at the moment, and I generally agree that there is no point in writing the Labour Party manifesto for 2024, or as we now hear, might be 23, and then just let the Tories take a pot shot at it. I get that. But I think one or two big ideas could have been introduced. I mean, and social care is screaming out there. I mean, if Labour had actually bitten the bullet, because Frank knows from my blogs that I think both parties are being really cowardly about this. And if Labour spoke frankly about and what it needs to do on social care, that would have been one thing. But I am very interested in what you said about that Labour should prioritise crime, because that would serve two purposes. One, it would, it is a good point that you make. But secondly, it would deal with this maybe a slight perception, because the Tories always claim crime as being their issue. Well, if Boris is moving on to your lawn over spending, then his lawn over crime. I think that was a very interesting suggestion.
Absolutely.
Sorry, Adam. I just want to stick with the Conservatives for a moment in terms of Jim's comment earlier, 11 years in power. And of course, again, I would suggest that people don't feel as though they've had a Conservative government for a continuous 11 years. So you've had the coalition government, and I think what Cameron and Osborne were very good at was saying that everything that they did good was their idea, and everything that was bad was the Lib Dems' idea, and the Liberal Democrats have never recovered from that partnership back in 2010. Then you have the Cameron sort of implosion over Brexit, very limited time in number 10 as a Prime Minister with a majority. Then Theresa May's government, which was just embroiled in Brexit for a couple of years, and nobody said anything about much else during that period of time. If anything, I think the Labour brand was probably tarnished during that couple of years of May's government, because it was perceived simply as the party that wanted a second referendum. So we then come to Boris, and it's almost like another new government. He's not seen as part of any of those previous administrations. So I think on the plus side, from the Conservatives' perspective at the moment, is Boris is still in a relative honeymoon period. I'll tell you where the challenge, I think, is going to come from, though, Jim, and it's, again, a phrase you used, being loose with the traditions of the Conservative Party. So for how long will he be able to hold this coalition together of libertarians who have hated the lockdown and actually have been very critical of the government's approach to restrictions, and the economy and the spending that is being undertaken. And then how much is he going to be able to continue to spend before some of the more traditional MPs within his party say, hang on a minute, mate, this levelling up agenda might be fine, but how's it going to be paid for? There is at some point going to be that tension that Boris Johnson is going to have to overcome, isn't it?
Yes, I'm sure that's the case. The only thing is that the Conservative Party is incredibly, I mean, there have been exceptions, obviously, during the John Major era, Europe, discredited them, and obviously more recently, again over Europe. But generally speaking, the Conservative Party is incredibly good at unity, basically, and refocusing depending on the challenges ahead. I mean, you brilliantly illustrated what's happened in the last 11 years. The reason why it still feels fresh is that there have been such different approaches. Cameron, and it goes to Adam's point about only 2 or 3 messages running up to the 2010 election, showing that they were more socially liberal, didn't make an awful lot of promises on the economy and things like that, and that adjustment was enough to get them into office. Then they went for austerity, but then they sort of pulled back from that. Then they sort of adopted Brexit and so on. So I think they will continue to back him as long as he's a winner, and they'll be quite pragmatic about that. I can see your point that there'll be strains from the right of the party saying, hang on, all this money's got to be paid back. But I mean, I think that's a very interesting general question, and it goes to President Biden in America as well. I mean, both these administrations at the moment are spending money without really any regard for the future. The huge debts that are being run up. I mean, some people you talk to say it's all fantasy stuff and it can all be really written off. But there may be some tensions, but I don't immediately see, with Boris Johnson's record as a winner, he's in an incredibly strong position. And I hope in this Queen's speech that we've just had today, I hope he's going to use it to the benefit of the country, because he is in that period at the moment where he's at his most strong. But I can't guarantee there's going to be a huge fight in the Tory party, because they tend not to do that.
And Adam, I know, listen, you and I had a chat yesterday about the Conservative Party and this incredible record it has as being the most successful political organisation in the world, I think, electorally. And I've just ordered that book that you've recommended about the Tory party, when it was seen, it wasn't that long ago, as dead in the water. It lost 3 consecutive elections, to be totally out of step with the British public, on the wrong side of the debate on so many of these things that we're talking about this afternoon. Where do you think that the challenges might come for Boris and his colleagues over the next couple of years?
I mean, Boris Johnson has the mindset of a winner. He is absolutely ruthless. And I think if you look at the ebbs and flows of his administration, it's been an incredibly unstable period of highs and lows. So he wins the general election, he delivers Brexit. He gets COVID. He comes out of hospital and delivers an address to the nation, which sends his personal approval rating absolutely through the roof. He then, for reasons that no one will ever understand, stands by Dominic Cummings, who has in any sense has sort of undermined the entire national effort, and then they then expend huge amounts of political capital to save him, and so the big downturn happens. The rest we sort of know is history. There were periods of going back into lockdown at the end of last year, which hit him hard, and it was seen as him being indecisive. But the vaccine has done for Boris what the Falklands might have done for Margaret Thatcher, and in a purely objective sense, I obviously am not a fan of Boris Johnson. but if we're talking in a sort of political science sense, he demonstrates ruthlessness, and he made some enemies, some very unsavoury enemies in the form of the Vote Leave gang, who I think would have sought everything they possibly could to try and bring him down had he had a bad set of results last week. That now doesn't hold, and he is in for a period of spending, investment. He will see this as this sort of, he's had a get out of jail free card really given to him, and he will see now he's got basically 2 years. I mean, for anyone thinking, the Queen's speech today, we know that the Fixed Term Parliaments Act is gone. Not that was an obstacle to elections anyway, but he's got a year to build the case and build the pillars of his strategy for going into the next election, and the Tory message at the next election will be, let us get on with the job, don't ruin it now, and that's, a lot can happen between now and then, but that's going to be, and not least what's going on in Scotland. But I think he's in a pretty stable condition. I think he'll have support within the party. I mean, even those who are sort of, I know, and people I've worked with in various capacities who are involved in Vote Leave and other and other parts of the Conservative Party, they were not all big fans of Boris after the split, but he's stable and secure, and as I say, he will be looking up now to think, this time in 2 years he could be we could be sat here talking about what would it be, a fifth consecutive Conservative Party election win. That's where his mindset will be, and he will be focused entirely on creating a frame in the next year, which has been investment, levelling up, and trying to find wedges with Labour to go into that next election.
The only thing to say is that whilst absolutely he appears very strong at the moment, you hinted at it in the way in which he stood by Dominic Cummings for a while and so on. There is the chaos element in Boris Johnson, his unconventional approach to things, his inability very often to build a proper coherent cabinet team and so on. That we can't foresee the issue at the moment, but I could quite envisage the possibility of something coming along which he completely mishandles in a very undisciplined way, and suddenly the whole edifice could collapse. But just while I've got the floor, I do want to say to Adam, the other thing about Boris Johnson, particularly now, is, of course, that the Conservatives don't have anyone else on the patch to worry about. For a while, Brexit came up on their right flank, and worry, the eternal problem for the left is that there's Labour, there was, and it may really be in the past now, the Liberal Democrats, but we shouldn't end this discussion without noticing the growth of the Greens. And I again, Frank will tell you in my blogs, I keep hammering on about this, about is there no possibility of some coming together, not necessarily structurally abolishing parties and things like that, but you've got the Greens, the Liberal Democrats, and the Labour Party that Keir Starmer wants to create, and we're talking about fifth term of the Conservative government. I mean, in the desperate situation that the left are in and the centre are in at the moment, hasn't there got to be some sort of trying to meet minds and not just split the vote all over the place? Frank's laughing there.
I'm a fundamentalist on this, I'm afraid.
But we had 18 years of opposition. I know it's going to be 5 electoral victories if the Tories win next time, but it's not 18 years, it's 11 years. And as you've so eloquently expressed today, James, they've been almost chameleon in their approach to politics of the Tories. Listen, the idea that you can form some grand coalition, in my opinion, is for the birds. It's being proved to be extremely difficult for the Labour Party to hold its own coalition internally together. The idea of throwing in Liberal Democrats, Greens, and God knows who else into that mix just so that you can buy a seat somewhere. And I think the public see through that as well. So I think that's the other problem that you've got here. You know, this idea that Labour Party's voters are just transferable to whoever Keir Starmer decides to do a deal with in a particular constituency, again, I think is naive. And I think it would do Labour and perhaps even the other parties more harm than good. That's my take on this. It's a bit like having a debate about electoral reform. Well, you know, everyone wants electoral reform until they win. And then, as we've seen in 1997, you know, it very quickly moved off the Labour Party agenda. So I think that you can have those academic discussions all day long. The reality is that this country, for now at least, is a two-party state. It's fast becoming a one-party state if we're not careful. And we need the Labour Party, I think, to begin to be a bit more pragmatic in its own approach and perhaps modernise in a way that we've seen during the John Smith, Tony Blair, and even Neil Kinnock years. But listen, I'm conscious of time, and we haven't spoken about one of the big issues that you've both mentioned in passing. I'll come to Adam on this, because again, one of Labour's challenges is that it's lost Scotland. And Scotland, of course, was seen as a bastion of Labour support. But perhaps from the country's perspective, you know, more critically, this call for an independence referendum. What are your thoughts on that, Adam? Where are we as far as the SNP in Scotland is concerned?
So it was, I mean, it's very interesting, very significant that the SNP didn't secure a majority, very, very marginally, but didn't. They obviously, with the Greens, have a, if you like, a pro-Indy majority in the Scottish Parliament. What is about to play out in Scotland is incredibly fascinating if you're interested in politics, and if you're not, it's probably quite tiresome, because you have the SNP who are kind of this in the sort of last chance saloon for independence, and they've had a hard time. Well, they've given themselves a hard time of it in recent months, and the sort of fractures within their party have widened and deepened, and I think that is because as we get closer to the crux of a not conceptual but real possibility of a second referendum or even independence, the economic foundations of the argument and the security of Scotland to be able to be independent with its own bank, its currency, and I think that is where the cracks are starting to widen, and I think that's where the public discourse will move to. So you've got two parts to it. You've got Sturgeon will desperately want Sturgeon, who, by the way, lots of progressives in England think, you know, this is an amazing politician who's done brilliant things in Scotland, whilst their education and public services have been left as an absolute secondary priority, or not even a priority. Their sort of ideological outlook has meant that public service in Scotland have been hit very badly. So you've got you know, the SNP will be trying to make the fight about an independent Scotland or dominated by the Tories forever. That's an interesting part of the picture and the dynamics. The second part of it is, okay, the actual rigor, the rigor that will be applied to the case for Scottish independence. It will become exposed quite quickly that on some of the central questions about how the economy would run, how in times of crisis, independence would enable the sort of response that we've seen during the pandemic. So I think they are the two real strategic fights that will be had. The SNP framing this as being, we need independence or we're going to have Tories forever, and then the unionist side of the argument, which says it's just not a credible case. You've got to stop pretending that it's a credible case. It's clearly not a credible case, and picking apart in the case and relentlessly focusing on this. And just in sum, I mean, if you're interested in kind of what's going on in Scottish politics, Blair Mcdougall, who ran Bear Together, he now runs a sort of blog which has a new post seemingly every day at the moment about the debate. Obviously, he comes out from a particular perspective, but he's one of the smartest political strategists in this country. And if you're sort of wanting to get under the skin of what's actually going on, you might check that out. Notes on Nationalism, it's called.
Okay, thanks. James, Scotland, you might want to come back on my disparaging remarks about your idea of a realignment of the left, by the way.
Adam saying he was a fundamentalist on the issue, so be my guest. Watch the Greens increasingly growing in the south of England, and probably not the Liberal Democrats. I think they're in serious trouble. But Labour, particularly without Scotland, appealing to some university towns, and we'll go on with the fifth and sixth Conservative government. Then you'll come.
Can I make one point on this, because I feel like I can't not? So the Conservatives lost in '97. They had about 167 seats. They were told, people told the Conservatives they would never rule, they would never be in government again. They had no seats in Scotland. They had no seats in Wales. They didn't win by joining forces with UKIP. They won by mounting a convincing case as the people of the country saw it. So I just feel like it's a comfort blanket. But anyway, we probably shouldn't go around in circles on it. We just have a different opinion.
Well, let's move it on and let me be a little bit naughty here with whether Mr. Starmer is going to be leading the party into the election, because Andy Burnham has made some interesting observations in the last few years. I know he said he's going to serve his term as mayor, but he's not ruled out being leader, and he explicitly criticised the sacking or removal or whatever it was of Angela Rayner. He seems to me to be a man on manoeuvres, and I think Frank's heard about the possibility that Tony Lloyd could be persuaded to take the Ermine and make Rochdale available for him. And I mean, do we think this is all not Westminster bubble, but Manchester bubble talk, or is there something in it?
I mean, I'll chip in here because I think that, I mean, again, interesting to know what you say about Andy, who's had a fantastic result in Greater Manchester, it should be noted. But he did come out very strongly yesterday supporting Keir Starmer's leadership. So I think sometimes, it is a bit Westminster bubble. And also, he has said Greater Manchester is the best job in the world. And I think he would want to at least see this term of his office through before returning to Westminster, if indeed he ever does return to Westminster. So a leadership challenge from Andy, I don't think is likely to be imminent or welcomed by Andy, to be honest with you. But I do think it's a question that I'm going to throw back at Adam in terms of how much damage or otherwise has been done to the brand over the weekend. Because the one thing that Starmer has certainly been seen as, up until the elections at least, was a steadying hand on the tiller. Somebody who was confident, somebody who could trust with those big issues and big decisions. And I think you would have to be beyond ultra loyal to Keir Starmer to not recognise that it wasn't the best weekend that he's ever had in politics, was it, Adam?
No, look, it was an awful weekend for the Labour Party, and lots of my friends of years and years and years, people who go out, knock on doors, deliver leaflets, lots of whom don't sit on Twitter observing all the twists and turns, but the levels of frustration at all of the everyone who was sort of politicking over the weekend is just sort of, it's deeply frustrating. I think, look, the reality is political leaders see moments of difficulty as moments of opportunity, and the circus will move on from the Labour Party internal drama over the coming days. And I think it's just now if I were in and around the leadership, my thinking would be, what are the things that we need to be thinking about in the run up to the autumn? What are the Labour Party keeps saying it needs to listen. I think we don't need to listen, because we've been told lots and lots of times. There needs to be focus, there needs to be discipline, and there needs to be risk. So lots of people in politics are the most risk-averse people in the world, and the way in which you capitalise on moments like the weekend is by setting your risk radar in the right place. So you have to take risks, you have to be bold, you have to have fights to be able to move on and set the agenda. So there's no dressing it up. It's just a bit shit being in the Labour Party at the moment, but that doesn't mean that it's the end of the road, or like I say, 167 Tory MPs after 1997. There's always a way back. It just needs the right leadership, and then anyone thinking about what comes next is deluded, because Keir is the leader and will take us into the next election, and he's got the summer now to work out his version of the frame of what the next election should look like. And then we'll all be sat here after conference, hopefully even in a room all together, to discuss how it's all going to play out.
Okay. Listen, before we close, there are loads more that we could discuss. And as I say, we do have a Conservative commentator joining me later in the week, so we look forward to hearing what she's got to say as well. But I do want to look at the female politicians who've found themselves being elected during these set of elections. So we've got the first black female mayor in Liverpool, in Joanne Anderson, and then we've got Tracy Brabham in West Yorkshire. I don't know Tracy particularly well, but really good reputation, very energetic, dynamic sort of personality, and is expected to really shake things up in this northern powerhouse that has gone a bit dead, let's face it, a bit stale in recent times. And then a woman elected as the leader of the new Conservative administration as well, James. So first of all, let me get your take on that, and I'm going to finish with Adam on an entirely different point, I'm afraid, Adam. I don't want you to comment on this because I've got something else to ask you. But Jim, good to see. Good to see so many females actually being elected to these posts.
Yes, very, 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 very important, and we'll see how Joanne Anderson gets on. I mean, she's inherited a very difficult situation in Liverpool and is still committed to the referendum to abolish the position of mayor in Liverpool. We'll see how she gets on. The interesting one is Philippa Williamson in Lancashire. Over the weekend, Keith Idden, who was the deputy to Jeff Driver, I think thought he was going to be elected, but Philippa Williamson, who is the former chief executive of the Serious Fraud Office. So she's had experience of running an important department. She's been responsible for children and schools in Lancashire. She represents the Lancashire Rural Ward. And of course, she's leader of the council in a great female tradition, going back to Louise Ellman, who founded her political career as leader of Lancashire and introduced Lancashire Enterprises, which was a novel scheme in those days for working with for a local authority to work with the private sector and so on. And then we had Hazel Harding, Jenny Mean. So the county's had a formidable tradition of women, and we'll see how Philippa Williamson gets on. Labour were disappointed, as our ally, very, very good Labour group leader of Lancashire, but didn't make any inroads, and it was a generally, a difficult prospect. I mean, there was some comparisons were made with the Northwest not being as bad as the Northeast, but there were some disappointments. Police and crime commissioners, Conservative in Lancashire, a Conservative in Cheshire. So it was pretty difficult. The only bright spot for the Lib Dems was becoming the largest party in Stockport, which is significant because they were a thorn in the flesh of Andy Burnham's spatial strategy for housing in Greater Manchester. Anyway, the caravan moves on, and I mean, I absolutely take Adam's point about looking to the autumn and so on. The slight problem is Batley and Spen, 3,500 Labour majority, you know. And the poor old Labour Party, the focus is going to be on that. The interesting thing, though, is, gentlemen, that it was only a 3% Brexit vote in Batley and Spen compared to the 25% in Hartlepool. So this is a real, test for whoever is chosen. I've got no. It's just a thought that's come into my head. How about choosing Caroline Flint, the former Rother Valley MP, and more to the point, certainly a Eurosceptic? I don't even know whether she wants the job, but it'll be interesting to see whose Labour's candidate is there, because I won't bore you with all the frustrations that have gone on about the way in which the candidate was chosen in Hartlepool and having it on the same day as Ben Houchin. I mean, it was really a train crash waiting to happen. But sorry, too much nerdy stuff from me.
Thanks, James. Great to get your thoughts today. Listen, Adam, I don't want you to take the bait from Jim there, because there's two characters I want you to talk us through in terms of how you think they're going to perform over the next 4 years, and whether or not you think either of these guys has got ambitions beyond the mayorals that they have at this point. So one is Sadiq Khan in London. Of course, Sadiq ran closer than expected, I think, by Sean Bailey. And again, I've read commentary from a number of Conservatives over the last couple of days suggesting that had the Tory machine got behind their candidate, they may have even won that, the capital. I don't know how realistic that is, but nonetheless, Sadiq is back in. So what does Sadiq Khan do now? He's got 4 years in a capital city that is going to face some huge challenges post-pandemic. And then Andy Street in your neck of the woods, building a reputation, certainly seen as, somewhat of a ubiquitous character across the West Midlands, and does have, it appears to me, this ability to attract support cross-party. So what do you think those two guys are going to be doing over the next 4 years? And as I say, any ambitions beyond the mayoralities that they hold at the moment, do you think?
I mean, so Sadiq obviously ran a lot closer than lots of people expected. I think it will be interesting to see. I have I'm not close to his team or anything like that. It'll be interesting to see if, having run London for 2 terms, there is a sort of an itch to scratch to get back into Parliament, depending on configurations, all the rest of it. Then I think there's some really tough issues for Sadiq to really grapple with now in the second term, not least knife crime and crime amongst young people. There are some really, really substantial and tricky issues in relation to that in London, and I think there are on big social issues that need real political leadership to fix, whether, and we saw this with New Labour, whether it be homelessness, teenage pregnancy, the troubled families, where you've got political leadership and really gripping them, you can really start to make inroads. It's not to say it's easy. So I think Sadiq's got some real big meaty challenges to deal with in London these next 4 years before he'll even think about kind of what's next. I think Andy Street definitely benefited at this election from Birmingham City Council not going to the polls last Thursday. That's to take nothing away from a man who is incredibly hardworking. I mean, anyone who knows Liam Byrne at all knows that the guy has an engine, and he is one of the hardest working people I've ever worked with. Sadly for Labour, Andy Street is of a similar mindset, and he's worked that incredibly hard last time in 2017. These elections are very difficult, right? Because the sheer scale of the voters, 2 million electors, being able to reach them where you don't have where you don't have local and regional media that has the same reach and coverage that it once did. That's not to say it's not significant. It definitely is, whether that be, BBC, ITV, some of the local radio and local newspapers. But reaching those voters is really tough and requires big spends. If you look at Andy's electoral returns, he spent a lot of money reaching people like my mother-in-law, who was getting lots of direct mails and newspapers from him. You know, big money, millions of pounds in the last few years. So he's interesting in the Conservative Party because he positions himself as being Andy Street, former John Lewis guy, who sort of barely puts the party's emblem on his leaflets. He rubs some of the faithful up the wrong way, but he. I mean, I don't think there is a limit on terms, so I think he could go again. But I think that there'll be, you know, after 2 terms, there's a lot more focus on. You talked a good game. You made the case that investments coming to the region, and not just, you know, Birmingham city centre, but, you know, the voters in Dudley and Walsall and where I go from Wolverhampton will want to see some of the benefits of this so-called levelling up. Well, you're on mute, Frank.
A lot of people prefer it that way, Adam. They wish it was perfect. So listen, it's been fascinating to get your thoughts on the elections. We'll no doubt chat again, as you say, Adam. Let's do it live next time. And thanks very much. And listen, if there's ever a time when politics has been uninteresting, I'm not aware of it. But equally, I don't think I've ever been part of a period, and this is going back a number of years now, where the turmoil and I think just the unpredictability of what is happening in the political world has never been the way it is now. So I'm sure we'll talk again, and I'm sure that the agenda will move on fairly quickly. Adam, before you go, I've got to ask you, I've forgotten that I have ordered that book, but what's it? Just remind people what that book is, just in case people want to.
Peter Snowden, Back from the Brink, which is a very interesting read on the Conservatives' years in opposition in the run-up to David Cameron. It concludes it was published in 2009, so it doesn't have the kind of inevitability of the Tories winning, which I think is also interesting.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Adam. James, nice to see you. And we'll catch up very soon. Thanks for everyone who's joined us in the Downtown End today. And enjoy the rest of your week. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Thanks, guys. If you enjoyed that video, then please subscribe to our YouTube channel on the link below and be among the first to get to listen to all the latest interviews through the Downtown End.